Hi and welcome to Gender. We're going to review this chapter. It may not need to be stated, however, I'm going to make a statement about it anyway. You've noticed that your textbook has a significant American view. Now remember, much of what was occurring in the US was also occurring in Canada and around the world. So please view much of what you are hearing and reading in this course. It does apply to Canada. Now, in this particular chapter, we're going to look at the women's movement. Now, we looked last week at the men's movement, and I had mentioned that they had been not as engaged and involved in this sort of movement notion until later. The women's movement has been around for some time, and in fact, there are three waves of the women's movement. Society shapes how we understand femininity and masculinity, and we in turn shape society's view of gender through the way we communicate. This has implications for the rights and the roles we allow and expect of men and women. Now we're going to go back and look at each of these three waves and the philosophies within the first wave, which was in about 1840 to 1925, and its main focus was the status and rights of women. The second wave was in 1963, and it moved right through to about the 90s sometime, and it's about diverse goals, equality, oppression of women, politically motivated and motivations were at that time. And then the third wave from about the mid-90s and onward, and it's been influenced by the second wave and includes women of different ethnicities, abilities and disabilities, classes, appearance, sexual orientation, and gender identities, putting forward their role in all of this movement for women. Now, remember that the word rhetoric is to represent persuasive communication, and rhetorical movements are collective, persuasive effort to try to affect change in existing attitudes, laws, and policies in society. And this has been something that the women's movement has been very active in for over 100 years. There have been multiple women's movements. Rhetorical movements about gender are not uniform, and they embrace a variety of ideas about gender and pursue a range of goals. And we're going to explore the women's movements within two ideologies that have informed movement goals. The first we're going to look at will be a group under the liberal feminism, and this asserts that women and men are basically equal in most ways, therefore they should have the same rights, roles, and opportunities. The second group is the cultural feminist category, if you will, and it states that men and women are essentially different and consequently should have unique rights, roles, and responsibilities. So let's start with our review from the first wave and the liberal ideology. How was the liberal ideology expressed? Well, the women's rights movement focused on enlarging women's political rights. Among other reforms, early feminists desired the right to vote in order to effect political change. Now in 1848, and there'll be a video coming up here in a second, in 1848, Seneca Falls Convention was the first women's rights convention and was organized by Lucretia Coffin Moat and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Now Moat and Stanton and others wrote the keynote address called the Declaration of Sentiment, which was modeled after the Declaration of Independence in support of women's civil liberties. The Declaration of Sentiments catalog specific grievances women had suffered, including exclusion from the right to vote and all forms of higher education, limited access to employment, loss of property rights upon marriage. And at the time, the convention had little effect on the mainstream politics. So I'll put this video up and you watch that, and then we'll get carrying on. Now, although some African Americans were key players early in the first wave, tensions between white and black activists developed, particularly over whether to prioritize women's suffrages or African American male suffrage. Over time, the women's rights movement came to focus largely on issues of concern to white women, whereas black women turned their efforts towards advancing the rights of African Americans. So black men received their suffrage in 1870 with the passage of the 15th Amendment into the Constitution in the United States. The right to vote could not be based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude, so black men won the right to vote. Women of different sexual orientations and gender expressions and identities were involved in the early women's rights movements. They did not rely on men for protection and were particularly vulnerable to gendered inequalities, and they were less constrained by marriage and child rearing. Women gained the right to vote in the United States in August 26, 1920. In Canada, women won the right to vote in Manitoba January 28, 1916. Now, instrumental in this occurring was the work of 5 Canadian women known as the Famous Five. The women are Emily Murphy, Irene Marriott, Parlby, Nellie Mooney McClune, Louise Crumby McKinney, and Harriet Muir Edwards. And there's a video that I'll have you watch just now too. The cultural ideology. Now this is the other larger group. The cultural ideology demonstrated in the 1880s is what's better known as the cult of domesticity. A reminder, the cultural ideology believed that men and women were fundamentally different, not alike as per the liberal ideology. The cult of domesticity asserts that men and women were fundamentally different, that women were suited for the domestic sphere because they were more moral, more nurturing than men. This concept is called the cult of domesticity. In fact, cultural feminists of this time believed that women's higher morality could help eliminate corruption associated with political sphere if women had the right to vote. So, the cult of domesticity worked to end slavery, ban alcohol, and create child labor laws. After the mid-20s, the women's rights movement became fairly inactive for several decades, and for a number of reasons, including the national focus on World War I and II. Also, in some ways more significant, was the war effort that women entered into the workforce in record numbers at that time. And when the war ended, men returned home, women were fired as men took on the jobs. Women ended up marrying, having about 3 kids or more, and before they were 30, children left home, and by the time women were in their 50s, this lack of opportunity outside the home and family awakened, and this was what began the second wave. So the second wave of feminism from the 1963 through to about 1995 included liberal feminists and cultural feminists and anti-feminists. We're going to start again with the liberal feminists to remind you again, liberal feminists, men and women are fundamentally alike, therefore should have equal rights, equal roles, and equal opportunity. And we're going to begin with the radical feminists, aka the women's liberation movement. Now, when I was young in the 60s, this is a movement we were familiar with. It was a term I can remember hearing. It originated in what was known as the New Left of politics, which protested the Vietnam War and racial discrimination. Many women withdrew from the New Left in protest of rampant sexism and formed their own organizations. Now remember, this is in the 60s, and protesting by young people on many issues was occurring. It was a time of change, not just in North America, but around the world. Consciousness-raising groups, they were known as rap groups, now remember this is the 60s, are groups in which all members had equal opportunity to speak and became a significant form of communication in radical feminism. This helped women to understand that their individual experiences of inequality were related to a larger structures of oppression in society as a whole. One very important outcome of radical feminism was the identification of the structural basis of women's oppression. Radical feminists recognized that how things worked in culture had an effect on women's individual situations, giving rise to the idea that personal is political. One such movement encouraged women to reject sexism in healthcare and to learn and better understand their own bodies. The book Our Bodies, Ourselves was published in 1970, and it became it's the book that was very popular back then, and it helped women to this end to understand who they were and understand their bodies. Now, due to the lack of formal organizations, radical feminists were not able to change political policies and structures. However, they provide an important critique of sexual inequality. The second grouping, the liberal feminists, developed around the same time as radical feminism, advocates for women equality in all aspects of life. Liberal feminism was sparked by the publication of Betty Friedman's book, The Feminine Mystique, in 1963. In her book, Friedman described what she referred to as the problem that has no name, the dissatisfaction and discontent women experience due to their lack of opportunity outside the home. This lack of access was the result of structural and institutional inequities in the United States and in Canada. The National Organization for Women, NOW, N-O-W, is a liberal feminist organization and was founded in 1966, and it continues to work for women's political, professional, and educational equality. Now, while liberal feminism did emerge out of the needs of the middle class, the movement was much more radical, was more radically and socially economically diverse than it was often given credit for being. Liberal feminism is also not confined to the United States, as liberal feminist movements have developed in response to oppression of women all over the world. A third group in this category is womenism. Womenism was founded by a group of black women to show how race and gender intersected in this oppression of women of color. Now, womenists, they point out that black women, in comparison to white women, are more often single, have more children, are paid less, and assume more financial responsibility for their families. Womenists also focus on how class intersects race and gender in women's lives, working to make social services more responsive to the needs of poor women and improve job training and opportunities so that more women of color can have access to well-paying jobs. In 1997, the Million Woman March was a grassroots organization march to support African American women. Multiracial feminism is the fourth of the liberal ideological groups, and it builds on the focus of equality for black women by emphasizing multiple systems of domination. In this movement, race is especially important, but it's also intertwined with systems of oppression. So these are taking a broader view, saying the reason that there's these degrees of inequality, whether it be with African American women or whether it be with women generally, was based that it's not just our day-to-day interactions with one another. It's got this structural oppression. So that has to do with government, economy, schools, religion, family. These are institutions that affect these systems of oppression. Our last liberal group are ecofeminists, and they argue that there is a connection between women's oppression, and the desire to dominate nature. Ecofeminists believe that as long as oppression is culturally valued, it will be imposed on anyone or anything that cannot or will not resist it. This movement, all forms of oppression are linked, and feminism is about justice and ending all forms of oppression. So now we can move into the cultural ideology. Remember, there's these two groups, liberal and cultural. We just looked at some of the liberal ideologies, and now we're going to look at cultural ideologies, where the foundation is that women and men are different in important ways and therefore should have different rights and roles. The first cultural group we're going to explore is a group that are known as Separatism. They sought to provide communities for women to live independently of men. Now, that means that separatists believed that women were fundamentally different than men, and in fact, in that women, they value harmony, peace, life, equality, nurturance. Since society is dominated by a patriarchy and capitalism, separatists formed communities. Now, this was, again, back in the 60s and 70s, and these communities would be small groups to relatively large groups of women who would live somewhat in isolation, but only with other women. Their communities, apart from the value typically associated with Western masculinity, and so they lived in a pretty feminine perspective. They have very little political influence because they choose to live outside of the dominant political system. Now, alternatively, the revalorism is a feminist movement focusing on creating heightened political awareness of and respect for women's contributions to society. So the revalorists also desire to increase the value placed on women's traditional roles and skills. So in that instance, they're saying some of the things that men do are valuable and important, but then the things that women do are also valuable and worthy of recognition. So from standpoint theory, revalorists argue that women's traditional movement in childcare and domestic responsibilities makes them more nurturing, supportive, and cooperative than men. So as you'd expect, they have this group is focusing on because men and women are different, we can't devalue women's contributions of domesticity. We need to celebrate them and recognize them and see the value to family, to society. Now, as you might expect, there have been anti-feminism in the second wave. In the 60s, there has been and there still is anti-feminism. In the 1970s, Mabel Morgan launched the Total Women movement. And Helen Andelin, she founded the Fascinating Womanhood movement, both of which advocated for women to return to the traditional roles and values and attitudes. The primary support for this return to tradition came from women who were economically dependent on their husbands and who espoused conservative values. Women should be in the home looking after kids. Men should be working and making the money. Now, more significantly, the StopEra movement also developed in the 70s. This movement emerged in response to the 1972 and 1973 campaign to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, in the United States. The movement's major figure was Phyllis Schlafly, who argued that feminism was destroying femininity by encouraging women to be more like men. The StopEra movement was successful in blocking ratification of the amendment, ERA. It also it has still been passed to this day in the United States. It still hasn't been passed, to this day, United States. Interesting. Now, there is a second wave within contemporary feminism. Two particular that stand out. One is known as Riot Girl and Power Feminism. Riot Girl began as an underground movement in the 80s, founded out of the punk music and radical DIY, the do-it-yourself, politics, and ethics. They use music and e-zines, these are electronic magazines, to spread their perspective. They look like they would be instrumental in moving the second wave into the third wave. Power feminism is predicated on the belief that women's passive acceptance of discrimination and identification as victims is the reason for discrimination and oppression. Women can stop oppression by using their own power to control what happens to them and how they identify themselves and their experiences. Power feminist Naomi Wolf states that women's own belief that they are victims is what holds them back from achieving equality. Power feminism appeals to white, successful, well-educated women, tends to be less helpful for those without privilege, and emphasizes empowerment as influential in shaping the third wave. Now there is also what's known as trans feminism, and it's the movement by and for trans and gender nonconforming people. Trans and gender nonconforming people have been active participants in the women's movements from the very beginning in the first wave, and have informed intersectional feminism for decades. It argues that not only is gender socially constructed, but sex is also socially constructed. Society's expectations of how males and females should look, behave, and feel are arbitrary. 3 primary beliefs. People have a right to define and express their own identities. People have a right to expect society to respect the identities they claim and express. And people have a right to bodily autonomy without fear of discrimination and violation from anyone. Now, we're not certainly quite there yet, as there's still an awful lot of distance to getting to that point yet in our society. They believe that their liberation is directly linked to the liberation of all women. So the movement invites all people to reflect on the extent to which they have internalized gender stereotypes and heterosexual and patriarchal perspectives. Now the mainstream third wave. Some groups of the second wave feminists are still active today. Simultaneously, a third wave of feminism has become popular. The third wave is less structured than previous waves and are very diverse, including women of various races, sexuality, classes, and abilities. We'll now review the characteristics and features of the third wave feminism. One is intersectionality. Third wave feminists recognize that women differ from men. Women differ in terms of race, class, sexual orientation, body shape and size, and disability or ability. They seek to figure out how to speak to women as a group while still recognizing these differences. They see oppression as intersectional. That is, that race, class, gender, sexual orientation, and such have to be addressed holistically. Secondly, coalitions and alliances. Third waivers form relationships with other people and groups that work against various forms of oppression. Third, everyday resistance. Third wave feminists believe that the changes second wave feminists fought for have not been effectively integrated into everyday life. They seek to promote individual changes following the structural changes that have been made. And they say that politics must come from the embodied positions from one's everyday life. 4. Media savvy. Because of the era in which they were born, third wave feminists are immersed in the media and use media to accomplish their goals. And 5. Consumerist and individualism. This is not a component for all third waivers. However, some readily embrace girl culture and emphasize being sexy and feminine, which often involves a great deal of product consumption. Focus on individual goals and strategies. Identities are important in third wave feminism. Some say that this means that third wave will be unlikely to have widespread political success because they're not unified in their goals for the movement. Today we are seeing what might be a rise of a new fourth wave potentially, and that is the new HipHop feminism, and it's rooted in black feminism and is responsive to concerns of the post-civil rights or hip-hop generation. Distinct from other branches of third wave feminism because it's centered on the needs and experiences of young black women and draws on the hip-hop as a subculture committed to challenging the status quo. some form of racist discrimination have been prohibited, but systematic racism persists. From their early influences in civil rights movements in the 60s to the cultural depiction of black people and communities in the media, hip-hop feminism has been tackling these emerging issues. It can be heard in many of the current artists who challenge misogyny, gender norms, and women's rights. So this generally wraps up our quick overview of the many forms of the women's movement. So where do they go from here? Is there a fourth wave? The first stirrings of the new stage of feminism activism were evident in January 21, 2017, as women across the world marched with their allies in over 650 cities. Maybe the move will be more global shift, and time will only tell where and if there will be a fourth wave of the women's movement. There we go. I hope that's worked out well for you. We'll see you next week.